Hello and welcome to another episode of Literary Gladiators, the show where we discuss and debate literature in all of its forms. If it's written work, it's game. Let's meet the panel.
Gina.
I'm Sara.
And I'm Josh. And Gina, it is great to have you back for a second Zoom meeting, second season in a row, even though Gina has appeared in person in our fifth season. How's everything been, Gina?
Everything in my world has been awesome.
Excellent.
What about you, Josh?
Things have been going as well as they possibly could. And Sara, it's great to have you back on.
Oh, it's always great to join you, Josh. I always love our discussions.
Absolutely. This one should be a pretty good discussion. This is the first time we go over somebody who has been deemed a master of the short story, and that is Alice Munro. The work we are going to be going over is Dear Life. The discussion starter I have for this one is this. Dear Life is an autobiographical short story from Alice Munro's short story collection of the same name. Technically, it's more of an account. It's more memoir as opposed to story, because these are things that happened. Maybe switch the names a little bit. This work was originally published in the New Yorker before being published in this most recent collection of hers in 2012. She won the Nobel Prize in Literature a year later. This particular story is a general exploration of things that took place during her childhood and events that she recalls from her past. My discussion starters come in two parts. Number one, what did you think of the strategy of writing as recalling? And second, does this short story contribute to any argument that could be made in favor of her being a master in crafting the short work?
I really didn't know anything about her before going into reading this. This is in the fiction section of the library, at least where I got it. I imagined that most of the short stories in here were more so tailored from her imagination, but afterwards knowing that she more so changed the names of the people in the story.
Most of those stories in that collection are fiction. 4 of them are autobiographical, and one of them is Your Life.
Okay. All right, that makes sense. And so it's kind of like when she definitely clearly meditates a lot and reflects back on her life. All of these stories in here have such very precise, detailed notation of memories that she had. So she has to remember things quite vividly, but also when we think back to things that have happened in our own lives, at certain points of our life, we might remember it differently. So I guess as she aged and looked back at her life, some things might have came up differently than when she used to remember them. I have to say, she definitely has a knack for writing short stories, and she has a very nice flow for her storytelling too. She's very easy to read. It didn't so much keep me at the edge of my seat. My mistake was I read all this in about a week. A lot. This is definitely something I would like to read one of the short stories, put it down for a while, and then come back to it. Yes, that's a good way of putting it. Dip in and out.
That's the first story of hers that I read in the collection, and I read it for this discussion that we're having. I would imagine you read everything, and that was the last one you read? Okay.
She talks a lot about just human relationships, really. It's almost in every one of her stories.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's partners or child's recollection of something that happened. But they mostly all, for the most part, involve human relationships. And you can really talk about each one individually, but we'd be here all day doing that. So you kind of have to talk about it as a whole.
That's usually with short stories. You would do one at a time. And unlike many of other writers, Alice Munro is known for short stories, and just about everything that she's published has been either short stories within other outlets or short story collections. Many of these were previously published, most of them in the New Yorker, which I think it's obvious if you have the opportunity to publish an Alice Munro short story, you do it because the New Yorker is that's one of the elite places that you can have your works published. And at this point, even if it's a weekly magazine, they only publish one short story per magazine on average at this point.
I would say that what I gathered from the story, you can almost tell a lot about her character, but you can tell a lot about, as Sarah was saying, it's not about what actually happened so much as how she remembers it. When I was reading it, I was thinking instead of being one of those whimsical stories of childhood joy, it was, as far as childhood stories go, it was actually a little bit more laid back. That's the impression that I got from it. Although obviously there were some parts of it, for example, when the lady was quote unquote visiting how when dad was beating her, were the parts of it that kind of were definitely a little more heavy. Even when you're reading those, you don't get that super whimsical feel that you get with a lot of stories about childhood, which I appreciated because it was something a little different.
I would agree with that, and I think that one of the best ways to describe the way that she approached this was, I got the paperback version. I actually got this from Target, and I remember buying it when Charlie and I went out for lunch one time while we were going to college. She said on page 307, Rolly Grain, his name was, and he does not have any further part in what I'm writing now, in spite of his troll's name, because this is not a story, only life. The way that she is explaining this and recalling these events is more so her looking back on things that happened in her own life as opposed to making it an intriguing narrative. It's not necessarily stream of consciousness. I think the way that the things are being recalled are stream of consciousness, but she writes it as if it's a memoir and crafts it the way that a master of short works is able to do. I definitely want to read more by Alice Munro. I want to see how she approaches fiction. I would say not much happens as far as conflict and action take place, but I think that that's what this is supposed to be. It's supposed to be her looking back on her life, her childhood, as you said, Gina. It's her seeing her childhood as an adult, looking back, as opposed to trying to make it so that the intent is to entertain like they would in a box office American film, but instead tell it as it is.
That's what I appreciated about the story, was it wasn't dramatized like I feel like some memoirs are.
I think that she shared some pretty like the dance that she did with her friend that she calls Diane. Highland Fling. I think you also get that sense of interaction with other people, the way that her mother sees Diane and her family with scorn.
I definitely don't feel like we all said, like, she wasn't writing this with a purpose, I feel like, of entertaining people. Like, I felt like she was writing this for herself, and I feel like it's really honest in that aspect, and it makes it relatable. And also because she didn't give much description to many of the characters in it, whether they were real people or characters. Some of them had like some physical description, but besides that they were pretty vague. So because of that, I feel like people can also place their own face that they imagine in the story and kind of fill in all of the holes and blanks that made it kind of vague. And there's nothing even really in any of the short stories that like I would go up to someone and tell like, wow, I just read this story and this happens. Nothing like huge stood out like that.
From what I recall, that's what it seems. That's the kind of tone that Alice Munro seems to take. However, I think you made up a really good point when it came to putting yourself in the speaker's position. We read a poem back in season 10, recalling the home of one's childhood one could. It was written by Zimmerman, Colin Firth's daughter. When we read that, I think that we concluded that we got more out of it on the basis that it allowed for us to recall our own childhood, and that was a good platform or a launching pad to which we could do so. In this case, we could do that, but I think that the memories that Munro recalls, I think that the story is able to stand on itself. Recollection is able to stand on itself, too. I think that these are things that we can remember in the way that Munro is trying to convey to us, that she succeeds on that front.
I want to know why the girl went into the gravel pit with the water. That intrigued me. That stood out to me.
I don't think that Munro was trying to be that overbearing narrator in order to figure out why. I think that if we're in their place, we would be asking ourselves why as well. And unless that subject told them, then we're never going to know. All we can do is make a guess or an assumption.
That's kind of the fun of it and the enjoyment of it too.
So it was an interesting approach.
Yeah,
So.
I have to say, I don't think I've ever read short stories with this approach where everything is not dramatized on purpose to keep the reader's attention and entertain them. It was just all recollections of her life, or possibly combining her imagination with her past or how she viewed her past. I definitely never read anything like that, so that was pretty refreshing.
I think that with time, this can be referred to when teaching this approach. However, I don't think her intent was to give English instructors the tools that they need in order to approach a work of this nature. I think her intent was to write for herself and recall life.
Yeah, and like she definitely, within all of her stories, there's a lot about gender roles of her time, and she definitely seemed very independent, especially for her time. And even just now that like she taught, as I was even reading more about her, like she drove a car, drove like a fancy car and things like that. She just seemed like a very independent woman of her time, and it definitely also showed in her writing and how she viewed her past.
Yeah, especially since she started writing back in the 50s. She's had a very long and prosperous writing career. This work here, Dear Life, it's the most recent collection. By the time this comes out, she'll be 90 years old. She's still living, but as far as I can tell, she may have published a few individual short stories as of late. She's definitely.
But I am going to. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh, that's okay. What do you want to
But
say?
I thought I would elaborate on when you mentioned her looking at gender roles, because she did mention in the story that she preferred helping with pumping the water and working with her dad over doing things in the house with her mom, to the point where she was actually starting to give her mom some attitude and was upsetting her. Then the fact that she also finished school, even though many of her other classmates did not.
It is quite interesting that she examines that, and I think that's important because it shouldn't matter what you are of a certain gender. That doesn't mean that you're going to be strong at particular things or if you prefer certain things. But on that basis, I know that there was mention too when she was talking back to her mother that she would send her out to the barn and her dad would have to stop what he was doing to give her a whipping. It is worth noting that in Canada, corporal punishment is now illegal. Has anybody read the comic strip For Better or For Worse?
I don't believe I have.
Probably during its time, top of the line as far as comic strips are concerned. It was written by Lynn Johnston, and she's a Canadian comic strip writer. She has since concluded it, but now they're re-releasing all of the comic strips in rerun. But because corporal punishment is illegal in Canada, they had to censor all of that out. She says in parentheses, this was not an uncommon punishment at the time. I think that was her noting the fact that back then they would do it, but now they don't.
Right, as if it was a very common practice.
Anything else that anybody wanted to bring up?
Like we said, 14 short stories, so it's like can't talk about each, like we could talk about each one. Definitely it's something to pick up, read a story, and then put it down. It's not like, because they're all short stories and disconnected, once you finish one, you might not feel like totally engaged to like, oh, I can't wait to see what happens next because that story is over. So it's definitely, it feels more like a collection than a book.
Yes. When it comes to short stories and poems, it's best to examine each of them individually because each of them stands on its own. Any final thoughts?
Yeah, I enjoyed reading it. It felt honest and natural, a little bit like somber and sad. Definitely wasn't joyful or delightful, but something to connect with and experiences, even though all these happened in a different time period. Some of them didn't happen in existence at all. There's a way you can connect and place yourself in it and really understand what was going on. So yeah, I enjoyed it.
I would say it was honest. Dear Life, I think that the emotional state was neutral and dependent on what she was talking about at the time. It was dependent on the event that she was recalling. And I think that that's key when it comes to looking back on your life. I think that she's at the point where, at this point, she's gotten to where she wanted to be. And now I think looking back is just quite a nice thing to do. If you're interested in checking out Dear Life, all of the other short stories within this collection, I have the paperback and Sarah has the hardcover.
And I have it on my Kindle.
Oh, we got all the ground
All
covered.
three.
Actually, you know what? I do have one thing that I want to mention. I kind of liked her approach toward when I was reading even the parts of it that were supposedly sad, such as when she did mention that she didn't particularly feel unhappy even during these difficult times, which kind of tells me when you're young, that makes it, I think, more believable for me because I feel like when you're young, a lot of times you don't understand the gravity of certain situations, such as the fact that, such as her mother developing, what was it, Parkinson's disease, I think it was.
Yes.
Her father's business with the fur tanking, and then him having to go to the foundry in order to support the house financially.
I think
But
when you get
she didn't say that she recalled feeling unhappy during these times, which are things that these are things that would be very stressful for an adult. When you're really young, you don't necessarily have an understanding of the gravity of these situations yet.
Yeah, when you get older, you develop a sense of empathy, a greater understanding as far as finances are concerned. Making that connection to being able to make income is what keeps the roof over your head and food on the table. Someone who's younger, their realm is a bit more limited. I think that her being able to look back on that, being able to do it with that voice is very important. Her being able to look back on it and develop a greater understanding, she was able to accomplish what she set out to do.
She half kept her adult view and remembered her childhood view and basically combined them into one, and it felt very clear.
Yep, I would agree.
Because she's basically saying, this is my childhood, this is how I saw it then, and this is how I realize it is now in hindsight.
Yep, and that's the only way you can do it. You can't go back and change it. You can just go back and accept it.
Absolutely. And things are a huge deal when you're a kid. And it's easy as an adult to like invalidate how a situation was when you were a child. You can say, oh, like I was so young, or like I was afraid of things so easily because I was a child. But everything is so real when we're a kid. And like she really kept that valid to herself.
And I think that that's very important. The very last line really speaks wonders. We say of some things that they can't be forgiven or that we will never forgive ourselves, but we do. We do it all the time. I think that pretty much speaks so much about what she's getting at, what she's experienced. It's just a great way to conclude this collection. So.
I agree.
Alrighty then, be sure to join us next time on another episode of Literary Gladiators. For now, keep reading.